Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music's free, virtual, and very informal monthly series called Conversations with Our Curator. I'm Melissa Ziobro, the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Archives and a professor of history here in the History Department at Monmouth University in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. Tonight, we are chatting with two-time Grammy Award-winning Louis Armstrong historian, author, and archivist Ricky Riccardi about his book, Stomp Off, Let's Go, The Early Years of Louis Armstrong. Ken Burns himself raved about this book, right? I mean, that is some serious business there, Ricky. Ken Burns wrote, Louis Armstrong is quite simply the most important person in American music. He is to 20th century music what Einstein is to physics, Freud is to medicine, and the Wright brothers are to travel. In this indispensable and thrilling book, Ricky Riccardi guides us through the period of pop's own creative Big Bang, the first decades. Stunning. End quote. I do not know how I keep tricking such amazing authors to come on this program, but thank you, Ricky, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Uh,
Yeah, no, there's no coming back from that. Yeah.
right.
From-
I'm not even going to read the other reviews. No offense to anybody else, but if you have Ken Burns' blessing, what more do you need in life?
That was a
You'll
big one.
notice, ladies
That
and
was a
gentlemen,
big.
we are not discussing a Bruce book tonight because, remember, we are the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. So while we are Bruce's official repository, our mission is twofold. We also have that Center for American Music piece where we tell broader histories about American music history with our exhibits, our programming, and our publications. So tonight is a perfect way to celebrate that Center for American Music piece. Before we dive into chatting with Ricky, just a few housekeeping details, with apologies to our regulars who hear this month after month, but we always have some new people in the audience, and it is my job to spread the good news about all the work that we do here at the archives. If you're not super familiar with us, we are located, as I said, at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, just a mile from the beach and a few minutes up the road from famed Asbury Park. As a public historian, I really believe that music is one of the most accessible prisms through which we can explore our shared past. And so we are currently very busy with our programming and other events, but also in the midst of building a brand new 30,000 square foot facility, which will open on the campus of Monmouth in a little less than a year, construction gods willing. The new building will feature a roughly 250-seat theater, exhibits, the archive for continued research, a gift shop, and more. So you can learn more about our work on our social media and our website, which is springsteenarchives.org. You can also donate on our website if you are so inclined, because we are a registered 501c3. I will put our link tree in the chat so that you can get connected with us if you are not already. So, with that, thank you again for letting me introduce us to you a little bit. And we can get back to tonight's program. So, Conversations with Our Curator is a free monthly web series that features researchers and writers exploring new perspectives in American music history. I really wanted us to have some programming that was super accessible to everybody at no cost, whether or not you can come to campus for our wonderful in-person events. So after some initial questions from me, we will open the floor to audience Q&A. I keep these programs to no more than 1 hour max. I recently posted the books through the end of 2025, so you can see that whole list on our website, which again is springsteenarchives.org. Next month, we are closing out summer by chatting with the editor of the literary magazine Beach Badge because, right, down the shore, everything's all right. So we're going to close out the summer talking about Beach Badge. So, with that, I will stop my rambling and we will turn things over to Ricky. Ricky, why don't you start just by giving us a little overview of you and your career?
1 hour? You said we have 1 hour? Oh man.
We're both talkers. This is going to go horribly awry, I feel like.
Yeah. First and last question. All right, how do I boil it down? It's kind of ridiculous because like, Melissa and I both are in walking in very, very similar shadows of these icons, and this the power of archives and teaching and writing and the whole thing. It's kind of my whole my whole bag. I always say I'm all Armstrong all the time. It wasn't always that way. Next month, less than a month, will be my 45th birthday, and it's definitely one we're celebrating because it's also the 30th anniversary of it was around September, October 1995, when most 15-year-olds on the Jersey Shore were debating, Nirvana or everything else was going on in the mid 90s. I was going through a Jimmy Stewart phase, watching old movies, and the sounds of New Orleans music was starting to enter my brain. And all of a sudden, I saw a movie called The Glenn Miller Story, and here comes Louis Armstrong, and that was the moment that something kind of shifted in my brain. I said, "Huh, this guy's pretty good. I better check him out." Went to the Ocean County Library here in Toms River and checked out a cassette compilation of Armstrong's 1950s recordings. I probably still have it somewhere in this room, and that was the moment I was like, "All right, well, nothing will ever be the same." So I went back to the library, started reading books about Armstrong, and every book had the same narrative that Louis Armstrong was a genius as a young man, that in 1929 he hit a wall. He went commercial, he sold out, he became a clown, he's singing Hello Dolly, he's on the Ed Sullivan Show. What a waste of talent. I'm a high school kid, and for some reason that narrative did not sit well with me. And so 2 years later, 1997, a giant book that is on my shelf came out that I still know the numbers. It was 424 pages on Armstrong's early years and 70 pages on his later years. So that was the moment in high school. I said, I'm going to write a book about Louis Armstrong's later years. So flash forward, I went to Rutgers. Sorry, but I went to Rutgers. I got a master's in jazz history and research, a very lucrative profession. It's not. I painted houses for 4 years with my master's degree, but the whole time I was doing that, I started an Armstrong blog, and I was meeting the musicians who played in his band, his producers, his photographers, anybody who knew him. I wrote a 350-page master's thesis and hired an agent and was trying to get things going. And then finally, it took a long time, but 2009, things started falling into place. I got a book deal with Pantheon to write my first book about Armstrong's later years. I got my dream job, the only job I'm qualified for, running the Louis Armstrong archives, which were at Queens College at the time. And that first book, let's see, props. I have props. First book, here's the paperback version. It's become a collector's item. It's been out of print, but it's a story for another day. What a Wonderful World came out in 2011. And at that point, I said, well, that's it. I got my dream job, and I wrote the book I dreamed about in high school. I'm no longer painting houses. I can retire. And little did I know the next decade would be probably the most exciting decade, because all of a sudden I got into the recording studios, Universal Music, Sony, anybody who owned Armstrong's records. When they wanted to do reissues, they would call me, ask me for ideas, unissued concerts, writing liner notes. So I did that for a while. I began teaching an Armstrong course at Lincoln Center, teaching an Armstrong course at Queens College. And then I realized that people were also sleeping on Armstrong's middle period. I mentioned 1929 was like the big cutoff. So I said, all right, my first book handled 1947 to Armstrong's death in 71. People are sleeping on the middle period. So along comes more props. Heartful Rhythm, the big band years of Louis Armstrong, which came out in 2020, actually. Social media reminded me, I think it was on this date in 2020 that my author's copies arrived. So two books down. And then around that time, my editor at Oxford University Press said, do you want to finish the trilogy? And my first thought was no, because the early years of Armstrong were the most lauded, most covered years. But I'm happy I changed my mind because the new book, Stomp Off, Let's Go, yes, reverse chronology. People now think of as some brilliant plan that I hatched 30 years ago to do it backwards. It wasn't. This is a plan that I kind of stumbled into. But the three books are now out there. The trilogy is complete. And yeah, like I said, I'm all Armstrong all the time, celebrating 16 years at the Louis Armstrong House Museum. We opened up our own Louis Armstrong Center 2 years ago using the same exhibit designers the Springsteen Center is using. I'm still in charge of the archives, which moved from Queens College to the new building. I still teach for Queens College and still write liner notes. As Melissa mentioned, I've won 2 Grammys in the last 4 years just for writing album notes, which is such a comical category. I've had a lot of fun with it because anybody under the age of 40 trying to explain album notes, it just gets blank stares. But I love doing it, and yeah, that's the best I can do in 7 minutes.
It is so heartening to see someone just so enthusiastic about their work, Ricky. I absolutely love it. Um, Give us a little overview, and you've hinted at this a little bit, but we're all about education here, and a lot of our audience is generally Springsteen fans. Give us an overview of Louis Armstrong's life and influence.
Well, I mean, the simplest thing I see some of my pals in here, so some folks have have heard this rant before, but um, for me, the simplest way of summing it up is you can name a million great vocalists and you can name a million great instrumentalists. Louis Armstrong is the only person within a handful of years in the 1920s. He completely changed the way people played music on their instruments. So just with his trumpet, he basically perfects the concept of how to solo, how to phrase, how to swing, what he does rhythmically. He expands the range of the horn. His phrasing is still the phrasing. You can find it in, I was listening to BB King earlier, that you can find in anybody for the last 100 years, literally Armstrong's Hot Five recordings celebrating a centennial this November 12th. So that's the trumpet. And then there's his voice, which everybody kind of smiles at, gravelly, what a wonderful world, how cute. He basically emancipated, the American popular song. Before him, people sang the lyrics just the way they were written, and he made every song his own. And so just by popularizing scat singing by words like baby and stuff like that, which Justin Bieber's baby 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 came over the loudspeaker at dinner tonight. But Armstrong was incorporating baby into his singing like it was natural. Passion, all that kind of stuff. So you can follow his vocal rhythms through rock and roll, through rhythm and blues, through soul, into hip hop. And so for one guy to kind of have that much command over what followed, that's it. To me, he's it. But then, you throw in civil rights, you throw in his rags to riches story, you throw in the fact that he lives through, you know, um, post Reconstruction New Orleans, World War I, the Spanish flu, the Roaring Twenties, the stock market crash, the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights struggle. He's integrating his band after Jackie Robinson. He's dedicating songs to the mothers of soldiers in Vietnam. He's recording acoustically in the 1920s. He's recording in stereo in 1970. He's on film, 30 plus films. He's on the radio, first African American to have a nationally sponsored radio show. He makes television appearances, breaking down color lines everywhere, box office records, hit records in every decade. And props I did not plan on showing. 50 plus years after he died, we have What a Wonderful World goes five times platinum. And this was just last year. Verve sent that to me, and I still haven't hung it up here in the home office. And so for me, he's the defining figure of the 20th century. He dies in 1971, so somebody needs to carry the ball. I think Bruce is a great. Bruce can pick it up from the 70s and take us to the end into the millennium. But for me, you can't, like I teach this course at Queens College called Music of Louis Armstrong, and the students think it's going to be, well, what is this? Here's a great recording this week and a great recording next week. Sure, but it's really a history class because his life, you can't touch the music without touching the history and the surroundings and everything that went with it.
Yeah, this is something I say about Bruce all the time. Whether or not you like an artist's music, right? Whether their music appeals to you, for some artists, their historical significance and cultural impact is undeniable, regardless of what you think about the music, because their work, their life experience becomes this primary source that can help us to understand American life. Would you agree with that?
1000%. And, like I said, Armstrong, with each passing decade, he's just, it's almost like this Zelig kind of figure, but at the same way, he's leading the way. So, when the government starts sending jazz musicians overseas, the State Department, he's Ambassador Satch. When the Beatles come to America, who's the artist who knocks off the Beatles? It's Louis Armstrong. And so, you do get this study of America through 1901 to 1971 just by following a figure like Armstrong. And like I said, you continue the story and pick somebody like Bruce. The music is obviously what they will always be best known for, but they reflect the times. And I think there's no better way to teach American history than through these figures. I was just asked that in New Orleans last week. How are people going to know that Louis Armstrong was this important? How is he going to remain relevant? He was born in 1901. And I really think it's the classroom is going to, really take the lead, because we get school groups almost every day at the Louis Armstrong Center. And we have teachers coming, learning how to do Armstrong curriculums, elementary school teachers, college professors, people who aren't even music teachers are coming to us asking for tips. How do we include Louis Armstrong? So I feel like as long as Armstrong's part of the curriculum, as long as students are learning about him, his story will always remain relevant, and his music will always remain relevant as well.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's important when we're dealing with younger generations to make those express ties to current artists and genres, right? Like you mentioned hip hop earlier, right? So one of the interactives we'll have in our new museums, for example, looks at artists who influenced Bruce and then current artists who are influenced by Bruce. Like how can we blend those trends, carry those trends through generations?
Yeah, I bring a great trumpeter, Alfonso Horn. He's always a special guest in my class, and he dares my students. He's like, name an artist. I'll bring him back to Louis Armstrong. And they throw Lizzo. He's all right, Lizzo. Coming from Aretha Franklin. Aretha's coming from Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson's in New Orleans. Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith records with Louis Armstrong. And so there are ways. And one thing, there are ways to make it abundantly clear how Armstrong has touched this current century just by playing. I could play some of his rhythms and his solos and play something now, and it's like, there it is. We're still leaning on that. One thing that I had to learn, which was difficult, I think I would think it would be easier with Bruce, but maybe not, because the calendar is merciless. The calendar is merciless. But when I first started teaching Armstrong to students, I was so in deep, and I knew that his 1920s recordings were so influential that I figured everybody's going to hear this. So I'd be like, here is Louis Armstrong's greatest solo from 1928. And I'd play West End blues, and I'd watch these high school kids and, college freshmen just kind of staring. And I'm like, oh, damn. I said, that bombed. And then it dawned on me, it's a scratchy recording, almost 100 years old. I don't want to get on my soapbox, but people aren't really playing instruments anymore. Music programs are getting cut. Band programs are losing their funding. And so, how would somebody in the 21st century, a 18-year-old kid, have any concept of a great trumpet solo? What makes it great? How do you play the trumpet, and why does it sound so tinny and scratchy? And so, my method is I play other contemporary music from the 1920s. And I play vocalists who sound very corny and almost comical. I play trumpet players that are very stiff. And then I play the same Armstrong solo from 1928. And then I watch, they start beaming. They get it. Sometimes they even laugh. And so that's how I've learned to kind of reach younger people. Yes, I have to talk about the 21st century, and I have to connect them to modern times, but I can also go in through the back door and show, when you listen to his music in the context it was created in, he sounds like he came from another planet. And fortunately, people are still picking up on that. That still does not miss. So I'm very lucky.
I love that. We got to meet the students where they are, right? And we have
Exactly.
to be creative and figure out what resonates with them, not necessarily what resonates with us.
Amen.
Something I want to hone in on a little bit, talking about similar themes across generations. There's this big discussion about Armstrong selling out.
Yeah,
And this is something we see with artists regard you mentioned Nirvana earlier, right? I mean, that was a huge preoccupation, something that haunted Kurt Cobain, for example. So we see that again and again and again. Now, of course, in Armstrong's case, there was a lot of race involved in this idea
sure.
of him selling out. But can you talk to us a little bit about that?
And yeah, this whole thing, people didn't realize it when it was happening. This was something that kind of the historians created. And as I said in my, my three books, I'm kind of undoing, I want to say undoing the damage. That might be too dramatic, but for real, in the 1920s, there was this whole area in the recording industry of what they call race records, records made by black musicians aimed at the black community. And Armstrong, I mean, I have a quote from his second wife, who was the piano player in his band. She laughed. Yeah, they did not think they were setting out to be innovators or to change history or anything like that. I got a record date. That's extra money. So they would go into the studio. Sometimes they would rehearse. Sometimes they wouldn't rehearse, but they would just go out and make the records and just have some fun and then go right back to work. Sometimes they forgot about these supposed masterpieces. Well, Armstrong is selling a lot of records. So in 1929, his record label said, "Hey, we're going to move you from the race records to the pop series." And this becomes, Armstrong becomes what I call the first black pop star. Now he's recording things like "I'm Confessing That I Love You" and "Stardust" and "Body and Soul" and these Tin Pan Alley tunes and Broadway songs and passionate love songs sung by an African American. And, by 1932, he is the biggest selling artist in the recording industry. So it's working. By 1935, you get the swing era, Benny Goodman and the big bands and Count Basie, Duke Ellington. They're bringing Armstrong's innovations to the masses. Now jazz is America's popular music. Well, in the 1940s, do I have a prop? I might have a prop. In the 1940s, they st- I, I'm the carrot top of jazz. Um, they start making these 78 albums where they would get Armstrong's recordings from the 1920s, repackage them. I have some of the later 1950s Columbia ones on the wall here. This is the home office right now. This is not, um, but all of a sudden, these jazz didn't really have historians or critics in the 1920s, but by the 40s they did, and they start looking and they're like, huh, the music he made in the 1920s was pure and untainted, and it wasn't commercial, and it was just him playing from the heart. And then they would go back to what he was doing in the 40s. And now he's doing love songs and comedic numbers, and he's making movies with Bing Crosby. And it's like he lost his way. And so for the rest of his life, from 1940, the first Columbia reissue, until he died in 1971, he was always in competition with his younger self. People always saying, "You're okay, but what you did in the 1920s, that was the real thing." And my first book opened up with a quote from 1956 with Armstrong saying, people were coming up to him and saying that to his face. And he would say, "Man, they don't realize I'm playing better now than ever before." So it's this whole thing with artists and longevity. No artist ever gets to a point in the 50s and 60s where they say, "Man, I've really lost it. I remember when I was young and great, but now I'm old and terrible." Yeah, they're always, refining things, they're honing things, they're maturing, they're learning how to pace a show, they're learning how to explore new sounds and new topics, all that kind of stuff. And so Armstrong was bored by what he did in the 1920s. He wasn't just going to go back and recreate those years. But now the historians created this line in the sand. 1929, he sold out. And that was the narrative that was the New York Times, a writer named Craig McGregor, about a month after Armstrong died. He was the first to really write an obituary bemoaning the Armstrong tragedy and how we should not let this happen to our figures, our great geniuses. They should not be allowed to, wallow away in commercial wastelands and blah, blah, blah. And that followed him in the 70s and through the 80s. And it really only begins to change when Louis Armstrong starts to speak for himself. All of a sudden, people did not know that he was his own archivist. And so when his archives go live in the 1990s, with his tapes and with his autobiographical manuscripts and his letters and collages, and this whole offstage side of him becomes available. People start realizing, oh, wait a minute, this was a deep guy. This guy was proud, he was smart, he was shrewd, he understood the game. And you know what? The music he made after 1929 is really good. And people like Wynton Marsalis would say, Armstrong in the 50s, you can't even touch him. And so now, I've done 3 books, but I'm one in an army. There's been like this whole starting with people who knew Armstrong, the late Dan Morgenstern, other historians who preceded me. We've all turned the spotlight on post 1929 Armstrong, and I think people have really come around. And then that whole theory of the two Armstrongs, or the serious artist followed by the showboating clown, that's all dead now, dead and buried.
So you have been working on Armstrong for 30 years now, right?
It's true.
As you were writing this book, are there still things you uncover that surprise you?
I mean, I've been making this joke, but it's a sad joke. But when you buy a car, and as soon as you drive it off the lot, they say, "Well, there goes the value." I'm not gonna be that dramatic. There's still great value. Please buy the book. I have 3 kids. They're very hungry. I need all the royalties I can get. But the stuff I've learned in the 4 or 5 months since this book came out, including an archival acquisition that came to the Louis Armstrong Center 2 weeks ago, that I don't think I can talk about. I'm sorry for even letting the cat out of the bag this far. There'll be a
Can't
press
tease us
release.
like that. Come on.
There will be a press release. That's how big
Okay.
this acquisition was. And my first thought was like, well, damn, I wish I had this a year ago. This is life changing. And so for me, it will never end. And I wish I had something to announce concretely tonight. I don't, but as I mentioned earlier, my first book went out of print. It's a long story. I'll make the 30-second version. It was optioned for Hollywood.
Ooh.
I got to know Tracy Morgan. There was going to be a Louis Armstrong biopic, and it was going to be based on my book. But the only way that could happen is I had to have the rights reverted back to me. So I had to fill out this paperwork with Random House. And the day the rights reverted back to me, they pulled it off Kindle, they pulled it off, Apple. It was gone. They just stopped printing it. And I said, well, who cares? It's going to be a movie and it'll be great. And then, needless to say, the movie did not happen. And then COVID happened, and then everything just sank without a trace. And the movie's not going to happen. Maybe it'll happen one day, but my involvement is over. And so that book is out of print. And so in February, I had dinner with my agent and with my editor, and we said, what do you want to do next? And I said, well, technically I finished the trilogy. I said, but that first book, I said, it's out of print, and it was 14 years ago. And I said, I've learned so much in 14 years. I said, I would really like another crack at it. And so I have a proposal in right now to do a revised and underlined, expanded version of the first book, get them all out on Oxford University Press, have them all in print, and all that kind of stuff. And so it seems like a done deal, but there's all the protocol, they're getting the peer review and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I have nothing to announce tonight, but I think that's a pretty good summary, that I'll never come to a point where it's like, well, that's it. I know it all. I could retire now. Always something new to learn about Louis Armstrong.
When I teach like historical methods or something like that, we talk about how all history is revisionist history because we're always uncovering new sources, new materials, and it allows us to see the past differently or to fill in holes regardless of the subject matter. So you're proving that point here. You've been at this for 30 years and you're still uncovering new nuggets of evidence.
That was the best thing to happen to me for this new book, because as I mentioned, I did not want to write about the early years because I felt like everybody wrote about the early years, including Louis Armstrong. He wrote his own autobiography called Satchmo: My Life in New Orleans, just about his upbringing, and it ends with him going to Chicago in 1923. And then when you get to the recordings, I mean, so many musicologists, Gunther Schuller, Brian Harker, Thomas Brothers, they've all taken a crack at the 1920s. So my first thought when my editor said, do you want to finish the trilogy? I said, well, what am I going to do? Rehash everything that's been in every other book? And then I realized, well, wait a minute, just in the last 10, 15 years, so much stuff has come to light. So many interviews have been digitized. At the Armstrong Archives, we received the manuscript that Armstrong typed up for that book, unedited, right from his fingers to the onion skin paper that came from the son of his editor, Prentice Hall, in 2016. His second wife, Lil, she was working on a book that magically appeared. We rescued it. It was going to go to a dump. It was in the collection of a jazz historian who passed away and didn't leave any plans for his collection. We rescued that. Tulane, they put up all their oral histories for jazz musicians. All were digitized and all made available 5, 10 years ago. And I can go on and on and on, but so many things have come to light that writing this book, Stomp Off, Let's Go, I did not have to pull off any of my other Armstrong books from the shelves. They're all back there. And I said, can I write this book without consulting Terry T. Chat, Lawrence Berger, all these other authors? I said, I want the only people quoted on these pages to be the people who were there, because, I want this to be the right first person on the ground. None of the, yeah, the historians bemoaning, that Armstrong did this and did that wrong or whatever that, or psychoanalyzing him. I said, no, he just left behind how he felt. Lil left behind how she felt. I got an interview with Lewis's sister that had never been published before. So now I had her perspective on things. The late Phil Schaap, his collection went to Vanderbilt. That was digitized. So all these musicians that Phil interviewed in the 1970s, I had their perspective, seeing Lewis with King Oliver, seeing Lewis with Fletcher Henderson. And so by waiting, I've made this claim. No one's fought me on it. But I think there's something new on every page of this book. So even if you've read all the other old Armstrong books about his early years, just by playing the waiting game, I was able to come up with something new. What's going to happen in the next 30 years? I don't know, but I'm excited because I can tell you the thing that can't happen 2 weeks ago. it's is
Stop
there's more
breaking news here. If you're not going
there's
to give it all to us, Ricky, stop. No.
there's more out there. There's more out there. That's all I'll say.
I, spoken like a true archivist, because you didn't need those secondary sources because you understand the value and the depth and the breadth of the primary source material. Truly.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's the key.
If I can circle back to something, you were talking about his second wife, Lil, right?
Yeah.
She had started an autobiography and you rescue it from a dumpster.
Yep.
Is that published or will it
Not
be?
yet. It's an unfinished autobiography. She turned in about 3 or 4 chapters on her early years to a publisher in the 1960s. And then the story was she got cold feet because Lewis was still alive and she was starting to go down the road of telling stories of life with
Hmm.
Lewis. So she stopped. So what we have, uh, you're making me just do it. You're making me do it. What we had was incomplete and not really publishable, though we've made it available to researchers. What came in 2 weeks ago expands it further. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay,
It
okay,
might be
okay,
another.
okay, okay, okay. Everybody, shh. All the people
it,
on this Zoom, shh, it's our secret.
it might be
Um,
another book. It might be another
so
book, but not.
in this book, the latest Stomp Off, you said there's something new on every page. But let me ask you this. Publishers generally give us a word count, right? So was there stuff you had to cut that you would have liked to include?
This book, I'm happy to say no. Um, so I think the contracted word count was 115 to 120,000 words. And well, I'll go back. I had made a mistake in my previous book, Heart Full of Rhythm, had the same contract, 115 to 120. And I said, let me just write it all and then I'll edit it. And I wrote the draft and I finished the draft and I hit the word count and it was 250,000 words.
Oh my goodness.
And I went to my editor. I said, I think I wrote 2 books. And I said, can we cut it in half and make 2 books? And she said, no. And she said, we want 1 book. And this always breaks the heart of my man, Bob Borgen. I see him in the room here. He's always saying, release the director's cut. But that one I got down to, I think, 140, about 140. And I was actually happy with it. There was nothing that got cut. 110,000 words. My cutting room floor was like a slaughterhouse. But there was nothing there that I was heartbroken about. This one, I was checking the word count the entire time. So I said, I'm not going to get it past
Yeah.
200. And sure enough, yeah, my first draft was like 170 or something. I said, oh, it's not too bad. I said, I can get that down to 140. And so, out come the razor blade, and I'm chopping, and I'm editing, I'm cutting, I'm chopping. And I got it down to like 158. And I said, oh, geez. I said, it's a long way from 140. And I went to my editor and I said, I don't think I can cut anymore. I said, I know it's weighing on the heavy side, but is there anything that can be done? And thank goodness they said, well, we can go up 15% more or whatever, which is 160. So if you're happy at 158, I'm happy at 158. So this book is it's funny. I don't know how they do it with the print and the pages. It looks like the smallest, but it's actually 158,000 words plus like 65 pages of endnotes. And so nothing was cut from there that was heartbreaking. My first book, which is why I want to do the revised and expanded version, there was some stuff there that I need to get it back in there.
Now,
So I
when you
hope
release that revised and expanded version of the first book, will it still focus on the period of 47 to 71?
same period, and I
Okay.
and I would probably keep 90% of it. But in my proposal, I did the math. That book was 133,000 words, and I said I would like it to be 158, like the new book. So I'll keep what was there and just add 25,000 words sprinkled throughout, and we'll see. It's in their hands right now, but I think they'll go for it.
Awesome. Awesome. So my last question before I stop being selfish and open the floor to audience Q&A is just a little bit about how you called, if I'm not mistaken, Lewis his own first archivist.
Oh yeah.
So
I
how do you take over that job from him?
oh it's 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 a dream come true, and it's also very daunting because he didn't really talk about this in his lifetime. He never said, I'm my own archivist, anything like that. What he did say, one of his favorite phrases, this is a story I've told many times, and probably our most famous tape. We have a tape where he gets into a pretty serious argument with his wife, Lucille, and they're going at it. And she doesn't know he's tape recording it. And when she finds out, I won't say what she says, but 4 letter words, 12 letter words, everything's flying. And she tells him to erase that tape. And he says, no, it's for posterity. And the first time I heard that tape, I said, well, there it is. I said, he is aware of what he's doing, even on this tape where he's fighting with his wife and not really coming off great. There's a part of him that's just like, this might be important. And so that was always in the back of my head. Then I met the daughter of his trombonist, Trummy Young. Her name is Andrea Young. And this story made it into the prologue where she told me that, Lewis would give away money. He'd be in the hotel rooms just giving away money left and right. And his manager would call him and say, what are you doing giving all your money away for? And he would say, what do I need money for? They're going to write about me in the history books.
I I put a big star next to that in the
Yeah.
book.
And so that was the moment. And so when I started, so going back to Rutgers, I said I wrote a 350-page thesis that was filled with quotes from the 5 surviving members of his band, his producers, his friends, photographer, anybody I could find. It didn't really have Lewis. Anything I was quoting was a Life magazine interview, a Time magazine profile, stuff you'd find anywhere. January 2006, 3 years before I got the job, I went to Queens College and I went to the Armstrong archives. I said, I want to hear one of these tapes. And they said, which one? I said, I don't know. So they bring me this giant binder and I'm going through the binder. I'm like, here, put this one on. And they bring out a CD, and it was an interview in his hotel room in Benton Harbor, Michigan in June 1956. And in that 30-minute tape, he quoted my whole thesis. He was playing better than ever, and the critics this and that. And I mean, it was one thing after another. I'm like, oh my God. And so from 2006 to 2009, I was just a researcher. And then in 2009, I got the job. I was hired by the IMLS. It was a 2-year grant, and then they kept me on. And so one of the things my boss said, "What do you want to work on?" I said, "I'd like to work on the tapes." And so he said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, the tapes." I said, "There's 100 of them have not been transferred, and the catalogs that you've made public." I said, "There's a lot of stuff wrong in there." And so over the next several years, I've made this claim And I always say I'm not bragging, but at the same time, I guess I am. The only two people who've listened to all 750 Louis Armstrong tapes are Louis Armstrong and me. And so I feel like I know him better than some members of my own family. And so, when it comes time to like write these books, I'm always trying to weigh that, I'm a biographer trying to tell a compelling story, what would he want? And I'm trying, there's times I quote him, I'm like, well, that's not going to make him come off great. I said,
Yeah.
but that's not my job. Now at least he's spoken for himself. Now
Yeah.
people will know, especially his movies. People are always arguing about the movies because representation for African Americans in film in the 1930s is pretty bleak, and a lot of the roles he had to take are pretty, substandard. But he loved those movies. He loved doing comedy. He knew that they were getting him out there. He loved the music. He loved Bing Crosby. And so I quoted him on that in my previous book. And so it's just like, I feel like that's a big part of my job now. Yes, there's Ricky Riccardi, the author. I'm doing my own thing with a million different sources, but I'm always trying to keep him in mind. Like, what has he not been quoted on? What do people still not know about? Do they know this side of him? Do they know how he felt about racism? Do they know how he felt about music? And anytime I can quote him and just go to the source, I feel like I'm serving, his longtime goal. I mean, it's a biographer's dream to have 750 reel-to-reel tapes. It's over 1,500 hours probably of a subject who died 9 years before I was born. But at the same time, what you do with those tapes, somebody else can come along and write three completely different books than me, using the same archives. And that's the beauty of it. I think people are going to be writing and analyzing him till the end of time. And the fact that he set up these archives, it's great. People will go to him. They won't have to go to anybody else. He made sure that, you want my story? They're going to write about me in history books. Come to me.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm a fibber because I am going to ask you one more question before I open it to the
Keep them
audience.
coming.
And that's simply if people here have not visited the Louis Armstrong House Museum and Center, tell them a little bit about what they'll see.
So the crown jewel is Louis Armstrong's house, the house that he moved into with his fourth wife, Lucille, in 1943. He lived there for the last 20 years. He died there. It's where he had his den. It's where he made his tapes. It's where he hung out with Dizzy Gillespie and Bobby Hackett and all these incredible musicians. And so the house is a National Historic Landmark, and no one has lived there since the Armstrongs.
Wow.
So that is, you can't, hey, Bob,
So it's like a
you
time
can't. It's
capsule.
a time capsule. People come in and they feel like Louis and Lucille are just like, they went out for lunch and you're
Wow.
just kind of like walking around. So that's the crown jewel. The new building, the Louis Armstrong Center, is the home of the archives. That's on the second floor. For that, you need to make an appointment, see me, and do research, or I'll give you the private tour. But on the first floor, we do have an exhibit area. We have a gift shop. We have an 80-seat performance room where we have jazz concerts, we have lectures, we have archival tours, we have listening sessions. And right now, we're open 3 days a week: Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Go to lewisarmstronghouse.org. You can buy a ticket. It's Corona, New York, which is right by Citi Field. It's right by LaGuardia Airport. It's an international destination. Getting people from Manhattan to visit is the hardest part because going to Queens is like going to Siberia for people in Manhattan. But the numbers have been off the charts. The gift shop numbers have been off the charts since we opened the new building. So we're very, very happy. And yeah, if you're going to come by, uh, ask for me, and I'll let you hold the trumpet and everything else in between.
Awesome. Okay, well, let me put a pin in it and open the floor to audience Q&A. You can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat. And John Barry is fast with the typing fingers because he's already typed. Ricky, have you heard the Jerry Garcia Band's version of What a Wonderful World?
Don't think I have. It's funny. I did a whole presentation on What a Wonderful World, and I lined up every version I could possibly find. I think that one eluded me. Thank you. Thank you for the tip. I don't. It will be
Well, you've got
rectified.
the link in the chat
It will
there.
be rectified by 8:05. I promise.
And
Thank you. See,
I
always something to learn.
John has been doing tremendous work coming up with Bruce Springsteen covers, and I'm always astounded by how many covers of given songs there are. So it's good question there from John. And you taught the archivist himself something new.
Nice, nice.
This is from
Appreciate it.
your, I think your buddy Bob.
Yeah, Bob.
Two things. There are no casual Springsteen fans. Same for Armstrong. Can you tell the great story of your job interview? They showed you
All
a
right.
photo. Oh, I'm intrigued.
I got it. um, so I started doing research in the Armstrong archives. '06, started the blog. '07, got the book deal. '08. I'm still painting houses every day. And then in 2009, my father's a painting contractor here in Toms River. And so it was kind of like, I'll go help the old man. And I couldn't get a gig. 4 years went by. And then the boss of the Armstrong house tells me that they had just gotten a grant to hire an archivist and I should apply. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I applied and I had a phone interview. First half of the phone interview were all Armstrong questions. Tell me about Louis Armstrong in the 1920s. I'm like, well, I got that. This job's in the bag. And the second half were all the library science questions. What are the pitfalls of retrospective conversion? And my dirty secret is I'm a journalism major, not a library science major. So I somehow get us through the interview, and so they call me in for the in person, and they say you're going to be working with the Jack Bradley collection, mostly photographs like this. And they reach into a box and they pulled out a contact sheet. I took one look at the contact sheet and I said, well, that's a Mercury recording session from the fall of 1964. They all looked at each other. They said, what do you mean? And I said, well, that's Big Chief Moore on trombone and Eddie Shue on clarinet. And that version of Armstrong's band was only together for 6 months. And in those 6 months, they only made 2 recording sessions, both for Mercury, both in the fall of 1964. That's that band. That's a recording studio. That's what that is. And so they all looked at each other. It was like, I felt like Rain Man at the moment. It was just like automatic. And 2 hours later, they called me and said, all right, you got the job. And so I haven't looked back ever since.
Nice, nice. I mean, it sounds like you were literally the only person who could do this job. It was made for you. Here's a question from James. Will you say something about Lewis's contemporaries? There were lots of great jazz trumpeters in the 20s. What made Lewis the king of the trumpet?
Great question. Speaking of King, let's see here. Yeah, no discussion of Armstrong is complete without a mention of King Oliver, which was Louis Armstrong's mentor. And this is the big box set centennial that won 2 Grammys earlier this year. So if you have any questions about Armstrong's world, check out that set. It's a 2 LP set, 4 CDs. And King Oliver was a brilliant trumpet player. There's so many. Bubber Miling with Duke Ellington, Bix Beiderbecke. But Armstrong, I don't know. Maybe I'm too inside. There's something about his tone, his phrasing, his drama, his passion. As great as those other musicians were, as I mentioned earlier, you listen to him side by side, and it does feel like he kind of came from another planet. And I feel like he is giving us the foundation of the language every time he puts that trumpet to his mouth. So God bless them all. This King Oliver box that we put a whole CD of contemporary recordings from the early 1920s, and you listen to them, great bands, African American bands, they don't swing. They have this stiff, kind of herky jerky feel. And Armstrong, his rhythmic feel, it's still the heartbeat of jazz. It's still the heartbeat of swing. It's the heartbeat of American music. And I think that's why he stands kind of head and shoulders above anybody else in that period.
Awesome. Here's another one from Bob. How about a few key recordings for the Springsteen fans to listen to get into Armstrong? I love that, Bob. Thank you.
Well, with Louis Armstrong, you can't go wrong. Um, the subject of the new book, these 1920s recordings I keep coming back to, as I mentioned, they are the foundation of everything. If you see the phrase Hot 5 or Hot 7, if you see Lewis and Earl Hines, I mentioned West End blues, Potato Head blues, cornet chop suey. These are the recordings that really set the whole century in motion. Having said that, as great as they uh, they can present challenges to modern day listeners who have trouble with 1920s technology. I don't, you know, I I love acoustic recordings. These are the recordings that Lewis made, especially with King Oliver, before microphones were invented. When they had a horn sticking out of the wall and the band had to balance themselves, and there's something magical about that. But the good news is Armstrong has this long career. So I said the 1920s, that's the height of innovation. But if you're a little trepidatious road, Armstrong in the 1950s, that's where I live. That's the music that changed my life. That's what I still keep going back to. Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy on Columbia Records. Satch plays Fats on Columbia Records. His duets with Ella Fitzgerald. His album Oscar Peterson. He did a thing in the 50s called Satchmo, a musical autobiography, where he redid 43 of the songs he originally did in the 20s and 30s, but in 1950s sound. And at the height of his kind of golden trumpet sound. Anything you see from the 1950s, you can't go wrong. But really, with Louis Armstrong, you can't go wrong. That's a simple way
No.
of putting it.
Not that you're biased, but no.
Not that I'm biased. Yeah.
I love this question. The questions are on fire today, ladies and gentlemen. This one's from Jim. He says, Ricky, astounding session. Thanks so much. In relating to Bruce and his music as community, can Ricky speak to how Lewis was part of the community of Corona?
This is more breaking news. I was telling Melissa right before we started the session. We received a grant last year to find 15 of the kids who grew up in Corona when Lewis was living there. And we flew them into New York and interviewed them with a film crew. And we have a whole exhibit starting in October. We're calling it the Corona Collection. And I don't want to spoil it, because hearing these kids talk about what Armstrong meant to that community, because he had enough money, he could have lived anywhere. This was a real working class community, but they treated him like a regular guy. They were respectful of him and of his privacy, but they also knew that he was very special. And he was generous with his time, dispensing advice. We've gotten stories about, on Halloween, he would give out money and stuff like that. And kids would come back around twice. He would walk to the local barbershop 2 blocks away. The kids would follow him like the Pied Piper. And so he loved Corona. And a big part of the mission of the Armstrong House is to kind of keep that community front and center. We give trumpet lessons to the kids on the block. We have block parties, we have concerts, we invite the neighbors, and Latin jazz and stuff like that. And so we feel like there was something about Corona that was really special for him, and we want to keep that feeling alive into the 21st century for us.
I don't mean to keep talking about Bruce, but there really are
Yeah,
so many parallels, because I often talk about how Bruce could live anywhere in the world that he wants, could have raised his family anywhere that he wants, but he does it here in Monmouth County, and people give him the space to walk around and go to Windmill and get a hot dog and go get ice cream, and and he used to have the kids come trick or treat at the house. So it really is interesting to
it's
discuss these parallels.
word for word. I mean, on every tour of the Armstrong House, we use the phrase "he could have lived anywhere," and
Yeah,
the fact that he chose Corona and Bruce chose Monmouth County says a
yeah.
lot about these guys. It really does. Armstrong could have been behind a gated mansion with a trumpet-shaped swimming pool and all this kind of stuff, but no, he wanted to be with real people.
This is a question from Rob in the chat. I'm going to read it, Ricky, but you might want to look at
Yeah.
it too in case it's a little complicated. Rob says, I just retired as a music librarian and archivist this month. One
Uh,
of his buddies through all of this has been Matt Snyder, who processed the Avakian, my
yeah, George
pronunciation
Avakian. Yeah.
okay, collection at New York Public Library. In your acknowledgments, you talk about the seventh tape that Matt found, and he told me about your Zoom session where he wanted to know if there was new info in there, and he said your reaction was priceless. In any event, do you know what we're talking about here?
I do.
All right,
So
share it with the rest of us.
yeah, let's see here. This that's me and George Avakian. He was Louis Armstrong's producer, and
Oh,
above
okay.
above my head, back there somewhere, is my wall of Avakian. The records that he produced for Armstrong in the 1950s, those are the ones that specifically changed my life. And those are the ones that also were the center, the set that got my first Grammy Award. So in 1953, George visited Lewis in Corona, and they had three long conversations about Lewis's autobiographical manuscript, which had not been published yet. And Lewis recorded them all and gave George the tapes. And so, flash forward to 1993, George finds the tapes, has them digitized. And when I was doing my research, I got access to those tapes. I, I can't tell you how many times I listened to them and how much I used from those tapes. So, before George passed away, all of his collection went to the New York Public Library. Matt Snyder is in charge of digitizing everything. And he calls me one day and says, "Yeah, I think I have a seventh tape from 1953." And me, I'm Mr. Confidence. I'm saying, no, I've heard all the 1953 stuff. He's like, no, he goes, "This was in a box. It was mislabeled. Didn't even say Lewis, but I think it's from the same time." I'm like, all right, yeah, well, whatever. So we have a Zoom conversation and he plays it for me. And within the first few seconds, there's Lewis talking about his elementary school, Fisk School. And this was not on the six tapes that I had memorized. So I almost fainted. And Matt said, you have to make an appointment. And so I made an appointment. This was January. I think I had to turn in the manuscript and very soon. And there it was. There was like a full hour of Lewis and George at the 11th hour of my research process. Basically, George had Lewis's autobiography, the manuscript in his hands, and he's asking him questions like an interviewer would do. You said this on this page, but what do you mean? What's the difference between whores and prostitutes? And they all these deep things. And I'm listening. New York Public Library, you can't copy anything. So I had one day, I was there from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and just listening and typing as fast as humanly possible. And when I floated out of there and I really had this kind of mystical feeling, I'm like, thank you, George. I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss this 1 hour, talk. And you can see the in the end notes how many times if you see George Avakian, Anahid Ajman collection, New York Public Library, that all comes from that tape. So thank you, Rob.
Incredible. It's incredible how the thrill of discovery is still there after all these years.
Like I
Uh,
said, it just does not end.
Tell us how you feel about this comment from Rob. Springsteen comment, I think his E Street Shuffle compares to the Hot 5/7s.
Yeah, sign me up. Yeah, I will back that for sure, for sure.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to be out of time because I promised we don't go over an hour. David says, can you speak a little about Lewis's relationship with various drummers? I read on your blog or in your book that Lewis said Barrett Deems was his favorite. I was curious about his relationship with Buddy Rich or Louis Bellson, as well as with earlier drummers like Baby Dodds and Zutty Singleton, Danny Barcelona as well. Thank you.
Lewis said all drummers were nuts. So that's a simple way of phrasing it.
I'm gonna
His
ask
all,
Max Weinberg if he's heard
yeah,
that before.
exactly. I'm sure you'd agree. But his all-time favorite was Big Sid Catlett. In the 20s, Zutty Singleton was his best friend. They kind of had a falling out. But at the end of their lives, they had a beautiful patch up. It's the epilogue of my previous book. But Zutty Singleton in the 20s was his man. Paul Barberin, a great New Orleans drummer, was his go-to guy in the 30s. Big Sid, they were like best friends, but Big Sid died in 1951. He was a young man. Lewis loved Barrett Deems, and at the time he said he was his favorite. As he went on, Deems, he had some personality quirks. I think Lewis said he makes coffee nervous, and so Barrett Deems got the axe. Then Danny Barcelona was a journeyman. He was a recommendation. He joined in 1958. Definitely not the greatest technical drummer that Lewis ever had, but he was a nice guy. He was friendly. Audiences loved him. He was always on time, and he had the gig for 13 years. I found Danny when I was at Rutgers. I did a long oral history with him, and I think he knew that he was kind of, not in over his head, but it was a gig that could have went to him. Buddy Rich or Louis Belson or somebody like that. But Lewis didn't care about skill. It was just, are you on time? Can I trust you? Does my audience like you? Do you give me what I want? And Danny was there till the end. And I think that says a lot about him.
Amazing. Well, that hour flew by. Thank you so much, Ricky, for talking to us about the man that you call the first Black pop star, and just more broadly about what it's like to be a historian, educator, archivist, and author. I want to make sure I give you the last word. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you so much. So we're all in this together. So I just think our missions are so aligned. It's kind of remarkable. And so just having this forum, meeting so many great people tonight. I hope to see you, some folks up in Queens, or maybe in Long Branch. Somewhere in between. But thank you so much. And you know, pops is tops. That's my usual farewell.
Oh, I love it. All right. Thank you so much, Ricky. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, stay in touch, springsteenarchives.org. We've got lots of events coming up. As I mentioned, next month's conversation with our curator is with the Jersey Shore Literary Magazine Beach Badge. And then, my goodness, have we got a lineup of Born to Run 50th anniversary events for you? 2 exhibits and a week's worth of programming. So go check that out on our socials or on our website. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.